Well, our discussion of fractions has moved into, ordering and comparing decimal fractions as it is indicated here. Ordering and comparing decimal fractions. Ordering in this case is used to mean placing fractions in order, starting with the smallest to the biggest, that is what we call ordering. And comparing is about getting to know which one is smaller and which one is bigger, or whether they are the same. Okay, that is where our discussion on fractions has moved to. That is ordering and comparing of decimal fractions. Now, here is the question: how do we order? How do we compare? Ordering comes when we get to know that this fraction is bigger and this other one is smaller. And how do we know that? Well, we have been given here a set of activities that we have to use to determine which one is bigger and which one is smaller. Now, we will be using the less than sign, okay? We will be using the less than sign or the greater than sign, okay? Less than or greater than sign to do what? To illustrate the concept of smaller and bigger. Well, before we look into this, activity, there is something that we would like to look at in trying to define how, we decide this is smaller and this is bigger. Now, normally before we begin to compare, we want to be sure that the denominators are the same, because then if the denominators are the same, then we can compare the numerators. We can use a number line, or we can just see for ourselves that either 2 is greater than 3 or 2 is less than 3. For as long as the denominators are the same, we can go ahead to compare the numerators. So we therefore say if the denominators are the same, then the fraction with the greater numerator is the greater fraction. Okay, that is, if the denominators are the same, then the fraction with the greater numerator is the greater fraction, and the fraction with the lesser numerator is the lesser fraction. And as noted, it is the numerator, that is, if the numerators are the same, that is are equal, then we say the fractions are also equal. Now we use the less than sign or greater than sign to compare fractions. Now we can go ahead and now look at the activities we have been given. Activity 1, we have 2 fractions, okay? The first one being what? The first one being 1 divided by 2. All right. Let's first note this down. We are comparing and ordering. So we are ordering. That's what we are doing. And for this activity, we are going to call it activity 1. This first activity, this is not where it's supposed to be. So we get this noted down here, yeah. So for this first activity, which I'm calling activity 1, I'm going to break it down into different parts. The first part, let's call it A. And now we have 2 fractions. The first one being 1 over 2. That is 1. And the second one being 1 over 3. So we write 1 over 3. Yes. So the question is, we want to determine which fraction is bigger, which one is smaller. We want to be using signs like less than, or we want to be using signs like greater than. Okay, those are the two signs we want to be using to determine which one is bigger and which one is smaller. Now, as I've indicated earlier, the thing we want to do first is what? The thing we want to do first is to make sure they have the same denominator. Then how do we do that? Well, we have to look for a number which will multiply 2 so that it is equal to a quantity also the same as, very much like we find the LCM. So what we are going to do here is we will multiply 2 by 3. Why is that so? It's because 3 is already here. Then also we multiply the numerator by 3. Okay, like that. Now that way we can compare. Now notice that for the second one, we now want to multiply with what? We want to multiply with 2. And then the numerator we also want to multiply by 2. Yes. So now we want to compare these two. Which one is going to be bigger? All right, let's break it down. Okay. Or maybe before that, when we simplify the first fraction, what we get is going to be 3 over what? Over 6. And so the first fraction will now reduce to 3 over 6. That is 1 times 3 is 3 for the numerator. And then 2 times 3 is 6 for the denominator. Then now the second fraction that we would like to look at is this one down here, 1 over 3. So we are multiplying this by 2 and that by 2. Now the numerator that we have multiplied with 2 will become 2 because 1 times 2 is 2. Then the denominator will be what? Will be 6. And at this point, we can now do what? We can compare. What are we going to compare? We are going to compare 3 over 6, then 2 over 6, this one, and this other one. Now, as I indicated earlier on, the fraction with the greater denominator, rather numerator, is the greater fraction. So if you compare 3 over 6 and 2 over 6, you soon notice that the fraction with the greater numerator is 3. 2 is the lesser numerator. And so we can go ahead to conclude that this fraction here is 3 over 6. Okay. In the next step down here, this fraction 3 over 6 is the greater fraction. In other words, it's greater than the fraction 2 over 6. Yes, it's greater than the fraction 2 over 6. That. So yes, this is the first activity on how we can do what? We can compare these fractions. So once again, you get the two fractions. Then after getting the two fractions, you make sure the denominators are the same. How do we make sure the denominators are the same? Well, the denominator of the second fraction is used to multiply the denominator of the first fraction. The denominator of the second fraction, which is like 3 in this case, is used to multiply the denominator of the first fraction. Then the denominator of the first fraction is used to multiply the denominator of the second fraction. That way, you will have two fractions with the same denominator. Then now, after that, the next thing we want to do is, since you have established that the two fractions now have the same numerator, rather denominator, you can now compare the numerators. And the conclusion is easily drawn from the fact that the fraction with the greater numerator is the greater fraction. That is how we compare the two. Now, we can extend our discussion into what? Into activity 1, part 2. Activity 1, part 2 is requiring us to compare 5/9 and 5/6. All right, so we say 5/9 and 5/6. So right away, we'll be having 5/9. That is the first fraction. Then the second fraction is 5/6. So there we go, 5/6. This is the second fraction. So the question is, how do you compare the two? Well, to compare these two fractions, we want to establish that the denominators are the same. How do we ensure that the denominators are the same? Well, we do that by multiplying the numerator and denominator of the first fraction with the denominator of the second fraction. In other words, we are going to multiply 9 by 6. We do the same for the numerator. That is, we multiply 5 by 6. Now that we have done this, we want to do something similar to the second fraction. So the denominator of the first fraction is used to multiply the denominator of the second fraction. So that 6 is multiplied with 9. Now in the same way, the numerator of the second fraction, that is 5, is also multiplied by 9. Now that way, we will ensure the denominators of the second fraction will be the same. And so what is going to be the value for the first fraction? Well, the value for the first fraction will easily be established, as the numerator is what? 6 times 5, which is 30. And the denominator, which is 9 by 6 for the first fraction, is going to be 54. So there we go. We have here 54. Now we go on to the second fraction. Now the second fraction, we have to multiply the numerator, which is 5 by 9. And when we multiply 5 by 9, what we get is what? 45. So we want to write this here as 45. Then the denominator is going to be 54. Okay. Now we are well placed to compare the first fraction and the second fraction. The first fraction this time is 30 divided by what? 30 divided by 54. And the second fraction that we are dealing with is what? It's 45 divided by 54. Now notice that because the bases are the same, in other words, because the denominators are the same, we will only compare the numerators, and the numerator with the greater value or the greater numerator is the greater fraction. And so when we compare 30 divided by 54 by 45 divided by 54, what we get in our conclusion is that 30 is less than 45. And this is our conclusion. So this is how we compare. Even when it comes to ordering, after comparing and knowing that these fractions are smaller and these other ones are bigger, you can rearrange them, you can order them. But it starts with the first checking and comparing which one is bigger, which one is smaller, whether they are the same. And so we can move on to what? To question 3. So question 3, I'm going to illustrate it as activity 1, part C. Now for activity 1 part C, the first fraction was given as 7 over 9. So that is the first fraction. It is 7 over 9. Now the second fraction is 7 over 2. So we say the second fraction is 7 over 2. Now the next thing we want to deal with is find a way of making the denominators the same. So how do we do that? We follow the step of the first two solutions. That means we have to multiply the denominator of the first fraction with the denominator of the second fraction. This time 2. We do the same when we are multiplying the numerator. We also have to multiply it with 2. When we are done with that, we move on to the second fraction. The denominator of the second fraction is multiplied with the denominator of the first fraction, which is 9 in this case. So that 2 is multiplied with 9. Now, when that is done, the next thing we want to deal with is to multiply the numerator also. So we will multiply the numerator, which is 7 in this case. We will multiply 7 by what? 7 by 2, rather by 9, not 2. So we will be having 7 by 9. Now notice that what we get, at least for the two fractions, will be a value or a quantity with the same denominator. And so because of that, okay, because of this, we can go ahead to do what? We can go ahead to simplify these fractions. And now the first fraction will simplify into a 14 for the what? For the numerator. Then the denominator will be 18. Now that is done. Now the next section, that is for the next fraction, we are going to be having numerator having a different value from the denominator. The denominator will still be 18, just like the denominator of the first fraction. But now the numerator will change, okay? Because we are multiplying what? 7 by 9. That will give us a value of 63. So we will be having 63 for the numerator of the second fraction, and we will be having a value of 18 for the denominator of the second fraction. Now at this point, we notice that the bases or the denominators are the same, 18 here, 18 there, but the numerators are different. Now we had said that the numerator, which is lesser, will make that fraction lesser. The numerator, which is greater, will make that fraction greater. And so we can go ahead to conclude that the fraction 14 over 18, okay, the fraction 14 over 18 is less than the fraction what? The fraction 6 over, rather 63 over 18. That is what we get in what? In comparing these two quantities. So from here, we can get this conclusion. Well, we can go ahead to do one more question, which in this case is activity 1 part 4. So for activity 1 part 4, we are also supposed to do what? To compare. So activity 1 part 4, I'm going to call it question what? D. Activity 1 part 4, I'm calling it D. Now the question is, how do we handle this? Well, to handle this section, let's write the question down. The first one being 4/5, the second one being 4/5. Okay, so we will be having this. The first one being 4/5. What is the second one going to be? Well, the second fraction is also 4/5. So we say the second fraction is also 4/5. Now that we have written the two fractions down, we want to see how to compare them. So how do you compare them? Well, we compare them by checking if the denominators are the same. So notice that the first fraction in this case is purely having the same denominator as the second fraction. Well, even the numerator, but we would not be interested in the numerator. We are only interested in the denominator because that is the determining factor. The denominator must first be the same before we can move on to compare the two fractions. And so for this fraction 4/5, which we got, we now go ahead and say 4/5 being the first fraction, 4/5 being the second fraction. We can compare them by putting the sign of what? The sign of equality between them. That is how we compare these two fractions. Okay, now the next fraction or the next two fractions to compare is in question 5. And so in question 5, we would like to call it activity 1 part E. Now, activity 1 part E has got the first fraction as 2/3. So we write this as a 2 for the numerator and a 3 for the denominator. Now what we are doing here is we want to compare this with the second fraction, which is what? Which is 2/8. So 2 for the numerator and 8 for the denominator. Now, this way, we can go ahead to make the denominators the same. And how do we do that? Well, we kind of interchange in multiplication the denominators. The denominator of the second fraction is used to multiply the denominator of the first fraction. Not only the denominator, but also the numerator. So we are going to multiply 3 by 8. Since 8 is the denominator of the second fraction, we will also multiply 2, which is the numerator, by 8. Now, in the second fraction, we want to multiply 8 by 3. So we will be having 8 by 3. Then later, we will multiply the numerator of the second fraction, which is 2 by 3. That way, we will have established a way of finding a common denominator from which we can make comparisons. So for this, we then have, okay, for the first fraction, the first fraction will reduce as follows. 2 times 8 gives us 16 for the numerator of the first fraction. And then 3 times 8 gives us 24 for the denominator of the first fraction. Now for the second fraction, we have, okay, for the second fraction, when it is reduced or when it is multiplied by 3 for the numerator and denominator, we see that the numerator will be 2 times 3, which simplifies to 6. And the denominator will be 8 times 3, which simplifies to what? To 24. So at this stage, we can now compare the two fractions. Why? Because the denominators of the two fractions are the same. So in the next step, we say 16 over 24. Well, 16 over 24, which we have to compare with what? With 6 over 24. We are comparing 16 over 24 with 6 over 24. And what is the sign between them? Well, notice that we are simply going to compare the numerator. And because we are only going to compare the numerator, you notice that 16 is greater than 6. And so we say this fraction 16 out of 24 is greater than the fraction 6 out of 24. And so we use the greater than sign of inequality to compare the two. Now in the next question, we want to look for this, that is part 6. So we are going to call it F. That is activity 1, part F. Now in activity 1, part F, the first fraction given, okay, the first fraction given is 6 over 8. So 6 for the numerator and 8 for the denominator. And the second fraction given is what? Is 6 over 9. So they have given the second fraction as 6 over 9. And now notice that 6 is the numerator and 9 is the denominator. What we want to do is to compare these two fractions. So before we go ahead to decide which one is smaller and which one is bigger, we want to ensure the denominators are the same. For that reason, 8, which is the denominator of the first fraction, will be multiplied with what? With 9. That is, we multiply 8 by 9. We do the same for the numerator. That is, we multiply 6 by 9. That is for the first fraction. Then now for the second fraction, we want to multiply the denominator of the second fraction by the denominator of the first fraction. So that 9 is multiplied by 8. Then in the same way, we will be multiplying the numerator, which is 6, by what? By 8. We are doing this so that we get the same denominator for all the two fractions. That way, we will get for the first fraction, well, for the first fraction, we are multiplying the numerator this time, okay? And the denominator will be simplified as follows. Numerator will be 6 by 9. So what do we get when we multiply 6 by 9? Well, what we get is 54. So the numerator is going to be 54. Then for the denominator, we want to multiply 9 by what? By 8. That is 8. 8 by 9, what we get? We get 72. So that's what we have. 72, denominator of the what? Of the first fraction. Now we want to look at the second fraction. Now from this second fraction, what we get is numerator, well, will be different, but denominator will be the same. That is 72. The next thing we want to establish now is when we multiply 6 by 8, what do we get? Well, turns out that we get 48. So we get it noted down as 48. So now we have two fractions with the same base. The question is, what else is remaining? Well, we just compare the numerator, and that is all. So when we compare the numerator, The first fraction is what? The first fraction is 54 divided by 72. And so we write it down, 54 divided by 72. Then what is the second fraction? Well, the second fraction is 48 divided by 72. So 48 divided by 72 is the second fraction. Now, comparing the numerators, which one is bigger? Well, when you look at 54 and 46, 54 is bigger. And so we say the first fraction is what? Is greater than the second fraction. That is how we compare the what? The two fractions. Well, we can move on to the second question. Rather, the next question. The next question here is 9 out of 10. Okay, the next question being 9 out of 10. That is activity 1 part G. So activity 1 part G, we have 9 out of 10 for the first one and 9 out of 10 for the second one. Now notice that these fractions are the same. And because these two fractions are the same, we will compare them just right away. So 9 divided by 10 for the first fraction. And also for the second fraction, we have 9 divided by 10. Now from these two fractions, we can conclude that they are the same. They have equal values. Okay. Then now the next fraction to compare, the next two sets, rather the next pair of fractions to compare, we are calling it activity 1 part H, which is what? 1 over 9 and 1 over 2. So the first fraction being 1 over 9, that is 1 over 9, and what's the second fraction? 1 over 2. The second fraction is 1 over 2. So how do you compare the two? Well, to compare these two fractions, we want to ensure that they will be having what? They will be having the same denominator. So to ensure that they have the same denominator, what we do is we multiply the denominator of the second fraction with the denominator of the first fraction. That is 2 by 9. Yes. And also we multiply this numerator by 9. Move on to the first fraction, which is what? 1 over 9. We multiply the denominator 9 by 2. Then later, we also multiply the numerator, which is what? Which is 1 by 2. Now that way, we can come up with what? With fractions that are having the same denominator. So the second fraction will then be having what? Will then be having 1 times 9 for the numerator. That is 1 times 9, and that will give us 9. Then the denominator will be 9 times 2, or 2 times 9, which is what? Which is 18. Now, for this first fraction, we can also simplify it, numerator separately and denominator separately. The numerator will simplify to 2. That is 1 times 2 is 2. Then we will now be having 9 times 2, which is 18. So this way, we can compare the two quantities, 2 over 18 and 9 over 18. So 2 over 18 coming up right here. Then 9 over what? 9 over 18. Right there, 9 over 18. So how do we compare the two? Well, to compare these two, we compare the numerators. 2 is less than 9, and so we use the less than inequality sign. So that is how we compare activity 1 part H. Then now activity 1 part H, part I, what do we have? We have 4 over 5 and 4 over 7. Notice that for these fractions, the numerators are the same, but the denominators are not the same. And because of that, well, we have to make the denominators the same. So those two fractions are different. The first one is 4 over 5. Then the second fraction that we want to deal with is 4 over 7. So this next fraction is what? Is 4 over 7. What we want to do is to make these two fractions have the same denominator. So how can we do that? Well, what we are going to do is to multiply the denominator of the second fraction, which is 7, by what? By 5. Then we will also multiply the numerator, which is 4, by what? By 5. Now, the next thing we want to do is to do what? Is to also deal with the denominator and numerator of the first fraction. And so this time we are going to multiply 5 times the denominator of the second fraction, which is 7. And then we also multiply the numerator, which is 4, by what? By 7. Now, this way, we can simplify the first fraction. That is, the first fraction will then be simplified into numerator, different value, denominator, different value. So 7 times 4, or 4 times 7, gives us 28 as the numerator of the first fraction. Then as the numerator of the second, of the denominator of the first fraction, we have 5 times 7, which is what? 35. Yes, let's hold on to that. Now the next thing here is to deal with the numerator and denominator of the second fraction. So numerator is 4 times 5, from which we get 20. Then the denominator is 7 times 5, from which we get 35. Okay, so from here, we can go ahead and now compare the two fractions. So comparing the two fractions, well, let's list the values down. So we are going to be having the first fraction is 28 divided by 35. The second fraction is 20 divided by what? 35. So from these two, we can then go ahead to compare the numerators since the denominators are the same. So for the numerators, what are we going to have? Well, for the numerators, we are seeing that 28 is greater than 20. So that is going to be the value. Then now, the last activity, that is the last part of the first activity. That is part what? J. So J we have two fractions, 1/7 and 1/10. So there we go. We have 1/7. Then later we have 1/10. So we start with 1/7. The second one is 1/what? Is 1/10. Okay, so let's have the second fraction right away. Second fraction being 1/10. Okay, so how do we compare these two? Well, let's just make things a little bit easy. So we'll have to multiply 7 by the denominator of the second fraction. So we get 7 by what? By 10. Then what we have done for the denominator must also be done for the numerator, which is multiplying it by 10. Then now in the next step, we want to multiply the denominator of the second fraction by the denominator of the first fraction. That gives us what? That gives us 10 by 7. Then after that, the next thing we want to look at is what we get when we multiply 1 by 7. Now this way, we can go ahead to simplify the two fractions. Okay. So in simplifying the two fractions, we will then be having the numerator 1 by 10 will give us 10. When we multiply 7 times 10, we get 70. That is for the first fraction. Now for the second fraction, what are we going to get? Well, for the second fraction, we now have 1 times 7, which is 7. 10 times 7, which is what? 70. Now we want to compare 10 out of 7 with what? 7 out of 70. Yes, this is 10 out of 7. Yes, this 10 out of 7 is supposed to be used to compare 7 out of 70. So, what do we know about 10 and 7? Obviously, 10 is greater than 7. So yes, this is how fractions are compared. And now that we know how to get a smaller fraction from a list of fractions, we can use this approach to do what? To compare fractions. And this is it for this lesson. This is going to be adequate for us.